morning, everybody. How are we doing? Tuesday, Dreamforce, okay? Reasonably? Coffee hasn't kicked in? I'm gonna go with coffee hasn't kicked in. Hey everyone, I'm really glad to see everybody here this morning. Super excited to talk about this. This is something that I focus on an absolute ton, which is our forward-looking statement. I spend most of the year getting ready for the, how many Dreamforces have people been? This is the first time. How many have been to more than 3? So you've heard all of the forward-looking statement jokes, so I got nothing for you. My name is Ian Glazer. I'm Vice President of Product Management at Salesforce. I look after the identity and access management services within Salesforce. Now that's everything from login.salesforce.com to our sign-on capabilities, to our customer identity capabilities, Salesforce Authenticator. So my team looks after a bunch of stuff. But I'm super excited today to talk to you about what we can do with registration. More importantly, I'm super excited for Sam here to talk about what they're doing, what Mavens is doing, what he has done for his customers. We'll get Sam a little bit more intro in a sec. He needs to also catch his breath from running in. But I want to set the stage for us. So no matter what industry you're in, no matter what geography you're in, if you want to run some form of digital engagement and have real meaningful engagement, requires that you have digital identity. You need a strong deterministic identity of someone logging in, engaging with you, that you can do more higher value things. Problem is, when I think about all of the different channels on which I may want to engage with a customer, it's really fragmented. And the problem is if I can't present a consistent experience across all of those channels and have good assurance about who is this person, I really struggle. And if I make it tough for the customer to engage on any of those channels, whether it's everything from a connected product, an IoT device, through good old-fashioned web browser, they're going to go somewhere else. That's going to happen. We want to avoid that. So this fragmentation is a real issue because what it becomes is an impetus for your customer to switch, to go somewhere else, to find some other service. This is something we really, obviously, want to avoid. Salesforce Identity gives you the tools you need to get your customers on these digital journeys. So it's everything from registration services, social sign-on, social registration, single sign-on, strong authentication, and a bunch of other things. So we view this as a way to start constructing that 360-degree view. And tomorrow, just as a teaser, I'll be on stage with from Ducati talking about what they've done around 360-degree view of a customer and their business partners, and you'll hear how they've applied some of these things. But it's not just that we have a picture of who the customer is, we've got to give them a seamless experience. So it doesn't matter what channel they engage on. It could be their smart recreational vehicle acting on their behalf to report telemetry, to open up cases in case there's a problem, all the way through just signing in on a mobile app or using social to sign in on a desktop. Do this all inside a brand experience. This is a super huge issue. So Sam's going to talk about this a bunch, which is our organizations, our customers, my customers have a lot of different brands that they work with. Sometimes these are geographically aligned, sometimes it's product line aligned. But what brand experience the individual starts to engage with, that needs to remain consistent. And actually you can use that to do a lot of creative things based on that brand experience. Salesforce Identity helps do that. And then pull all this insight from once they've engaged, what are they doing? Who are they? So there are 3 major parts of customer identity: sign up, sign in, and the onward journey. Now we're going to focus on just one of these. We're going to focus on sign up. Because no matter how cool it looks, no matter how easy it is, sign up is a hurdle that customers have to get over, right? If you want them to engage, this is the hurdle they got to clear. Make that too high, they'll go somewhere else, right? So it's all about reducing friction. Now to be clear, the story's a little bit different in B2B settings versus B2C settings. B2B, you want a little bit more understanding of who the individual is, and then enough data to activate them as a business partner. I have a lot of customers who have pretty rigorous processes, actually. For those of you here last year, you heard from Land O'Lakes, and they talked about their business partner activation process during sign-up. And there's a lot of steps to it. But in B2C, this is a real different story. This is about getting people in as fast as you can as effortlessly as you can and still gather what you need to give them a great experience. So instead of me telling you about the concept around this, I want to turn the stage over to Sam so you can hear how people are actually doing this in practice, some of the challenges that they have around that, some of the creative uses of things that are kind of new in the Salesforce environment. Like, for example, Sam's team is using Lightning Out, which is super friggin' cool, but I'm going to let Sam talk about how that happens.
Perfect. Thanks, Ian. Let's see. I assume my mic's working? Good. Perfect. Hi. So my name's Sam Rosen. I lead our commercial practice at Mavens. Mavens is a company that works at the intersection of Force.com and healthcare and life sciences, and primarily, honestly, with pharma customers. Now, pharma is an interesting industry because globally they're heavily regulated, and their interactions with healthcare professionals are also heavily regulated. And what's interesting is they actually kind of sit in the middle of B2C and B2B. The processes to verify that this really is a licensed healthcare professional are extremely complex, but pharma also wants to create a great experience for their customers to register, and they don't want to necessarily put a lot of hurdles in front of it. And for the most part, pharma actually doesn't really do registration. If you talk to a lot of our customers, they actually will tell you that's the last thing we want. We want to avoid it at all costs because they've seen the hurdle is too high. What we've come in is we've tried to give them a path forward because we want to allow them to digitally engage, and to do that you do need registration. So Ian and I met each other about 3 years ago when we had a customer come to us and essentially describe this problem. Our customers are interacting with us across many channels and many brands. And in 2 years, we want to be multi-channel first. We don't necessarily want to expand our physical sales force, and we're launching a bunch of new products. How do we move forward? And the issue, as we start to dig into that problem, was even within a single brand, that company could not tell you if the same person was interacting with a rep via CRM as was searching on their phone. They couldn't tell you across this that this was one person. They could say that this is Dr. Smith, but not the same Dr. Smith. So they couldn't have a continuous story. They couldn't deliver a continuous message. So part of our solution was to essentially propose the concept of what we call loosely an identity hub, a single place that interacts with all of these different channels using things like single sign-on when it's appropriate, but also things like web analytics, web sniffing, profiling, and other tools in the regions that it's appropriate to do so, to just consistently identify who you're talking to. What we realized is once we could do that and say for certain that this is Dr. Avery interacting across all of our channels, we could then introduce a new question which was fundamental to that customer's ability to interact with them digitally. How do we talk to them? Because in pharma, like pretty much any industry, you need consent. But the issue is the industry as a whole tackles consent in a kind of fragmented manner. Every application, every brand has its own consent management solution. And while that worked in the past, it doesn't work anymore, especially in Europe with things like GDPR, which are going to require the ability to say, hey, here's all the information we know about you across our entire organization, and we have to do that within 30 days. If we don't centrally manage how we're communicating, and we don't centrally manage who someone is and what information we have about them, it's not going to work. So we then proposed this concept also of a consent hub, one place globally that consent feeds in and out of, and is integrated via APIs to all of these different channels. And with that, we're able to also take consent away from a monolithic concept, one big long piece of language that says we're allowed to talk to you however and wherever we want to, and turn it into more of an opportunity. Fragmented and broken out where you're consenting to something in context. So no longer is consent just something blanket that then the marketing teams go, okay, now how do we want to communicate with them? But rather consent is informative. They have agreed to this, therefore they want to hear more about ColaCap because that's the entire scope of the consent language. And with that, then we're able to actually capture analytics around that. Because now that consent is targeted and our messaging is targeted off of the consent we're capturing, we can then ask the question, okay, we just saw Dr. Avery opt out. Why? Did we see a bunch of HCPs opt out at once? What was the messaging that was sent? What caused it? So we can now start to identify why they are opting out or why maybe they're opting into more communication. And then we can start to refine the messaging we send. So with all that in mind, essentially what we did was we created what we called the Customer Interaction Manager, which was a solution built on top of Salesforce.com, primarily the identity product, and then essentially combined that Identity Hub and Consent Hub concept, and then mixed it in with dynamically branded experiences to keep the customers in a single brand experience throughout their journey, because within pharma, an individual drug brand is the brand that most people know. Yes, you know Pfizer, but most likely you know their product more, just like you know aspirin, not necessarily Bayer. And when you're interacting with aspirin, Bayer actually, for the most part, doesn't necessarily want you to know that they're the ones behind it, because that's just the business model that they work in. And every different region may have slightly different branding, slightly different wording, or slightly different logos. So to continue, I want to jump into a demo, but identity demos are fun, but if they work right, they tend to be seamless. So I actually want to walk you through what we're going to see. So we're going to see Jane Demos, my favorite demo user. And she's going to go to Verteo Medical Information. Verteo is our fake pharmaceutical company of the day. So Verteo has a medical information website. She's going to go and get some information. When she goes there, she's going to find that the information she wants requires some sort of registration process. We're actually going to forward her to the Customer Interaction Manager in the same brand as Verteo Medical Information. We're going to have her register. After that, she's going to be able to access medical information, get the information she needs. From there, she's going to jump on to our form of an app launcher. She created a Verteo login. We call that My Verteo. My Verteo has an app launcher that shows Jane all of the different applications she can access. And then we're going to jump her over to colcap.com. And when we jump her over, we're actually going to capture consent, because the consent that was required to access Verteo Medical Information is not the whole story. Now we're going to capture some marketing consent as well when we go to Colcap. And now we're going to do it live, and we're going to cross our fingers that the demo runs smoothly, because that's the embarrassing part when it doesn't. Okay, so we're on our medical information self-service site. I'm a United States healthcare professional, and the information I want is not here yet. So we're going to go ahead and register. Now, when we register, we're forwarded off to the Customer Interaction Manager, and you'll notice that the look and feel of our application is actually pretty much the same, and that's because of our dynamically branded experience, and we'll talk about how we achieved that in a few minutes. I don't have a login, so I'm going to create a My Verteo account. You gotta love how lorem ipsum always makes the computer think it's Latin. So I'm going to register, and you'll notice our registration is pretty short. Demos. Give me 1 second, guys. Typing and talking is not my strong suit. And we're in the United States. So our registration is really short, and that's because we don't need to capture more information now. We're going to progressively profile her as she needs to access more applications that have stricter requirements. And while we won't see that today, we're going to talk about it a little bit and around the technique. So what we're going to do is register and always cross our fingers.
If you want to leave me your password, that'd be awesome.
Of course, Ian. So we've now arrived back on self-service, and now we're going to capture some consent. And we're always going to do a consent check every time we log into an application. We're going to see what consent's required for the application, what the delta is, and then we're going to present it. It's also a great way to refresh consent, because consent language changes, things get updated. So we're going to acknowledge, and we're going to continue. And now you'll see we have more information on the screen because we're logged in. We know that we're logged in as Jane Demos. We'll go into cardiology, we'll go to Colcap because that's the product we're interested in. We'll do a search for dosing, and we'll take a look at a dosing document, and we'll take a look at a prescribing document. And when we're done, she's done at medical information. Now, within this document, we may find some content that suggests that we go over to the brand site. And maybe we're going over to the brand site because there's some more information, or maybe we want to get access to a copay coupon, something of that nature. So what we're going to do, fully integrated, is we're going to go to My Verteo. Now, My Verteo is our app launcher. We can see that she recently visited medical information. And we're going to click on Colcap because that's where we're going. We're going to go to that brand site. And now the brand site happens to be hosted on Heroku, but it could be hosted anywhere. You notice we're immediately logged in, and we're capturing consent again. So this time, this is the Colcap marketing consent. In the past, we captured privacy policy, we captured market research. Now we're capturing the ability to market to you. And we'll click continue. And now she can go read about efficacy, possibly download a copay coupon, something of that nature. But you'll see the experience is seamless throughout. We've captured consent, we've progressively built it up, and more importantly, we've captured relevant consent. When we access Colcap, we've asked for the permission to market to her about Colcap because she's now shown an interest. Likewise, if we tried to access another brand like Labranone, we would ask for Labranone's marketing consent then as well. And next time she logs in, she's not going to be asked to consent again, and that's the key. So that's our demo. So what did we see throughout this process? We saw our dynamically branded page, that login and registration page. And what we call that is our fully assembled brand experience. And essentially, it's built out of a composition of a Visualforce template that controls the look and feel of our page, that menu bar, footer, the overall look and feel, and then what we call a child template. And that child template, we actually have some in Visualforce and some in Lightning, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. That child template essentially is the form, and we wrap it with this concept of an HTML top and bottom element. And essentially, you can put whatever you want above and below that form, and it creates a unique experience per application. And it actually gives a lot of flexibility, because when you think about fundamentally, the forms don't change. It's the content around that form that does, and the context of which you're giving that information. Now, all this runs in one community, and certain applications may have access to certain pages within that community, maybe a special registration page, a special process, and certain applications may not. So we had to come up with a good way to essentially control page access based on the application context. And the option of making many communities wasn't viable. So what we did was we created a base content controller, which essentially handles application access by querying the application configuration. Also handles cookie preferences. So originally, when we started this out a long time ago, we stored all this information in the browser. What we found out is it's actually better to store it as a record in Salesforce in JSON, because we have a lot more flexibility, and then actually store an ID to that record in a single cookie entry in the browser. That way, we have a lot more flexibility of what we store. There's also an element of privacy. It's not actually in the browser. So you can store maybe a little more sensitive information. You still don't want to go too far, but it's a way to obfuscate some of the information you're trying to store about that user. Sorry about that, guys. So then we also have our CDN integration. So when we started this, we realized that trying to control branding within Salesforce was not the right way to go. There's just too much to do. And it's not a native experience for the agencies who tend to be building these sites. So we built the CDN integration, and we also integrated it with a tool called Contentful, which is an API-based CMS that most of our customers have come to enjoy. And we tend to recommend because it's an API-first design, and it just happens to work really well with Salesforce and the technology that we've deployed here. So that's a bit about how we've stacked up the pages. This is about a 10,000-foot view. If I brought on onto the stage our team of developers who have worked on this, they could probably talk 5 or 6 hours about the different levels of complexity as we go down in here. But when we actually look at it, in the purple is our child template. All around it is our base template. And it allows us to create great experiences, and the beauty is it's all configuration-based. So you click, you set up, you move on, and the applications are ready to go. So the next thing I want to talk about is progressive profiling. So we talked about this registration page, which we all agree is pretty tiny. It doesn't collect that much information. And that might be okay to go to a brand or marketing site. That's as much information as we honestly want to collect. But what about when we need to go to a medical information site? Well, at that point, we might want to ask a question between that login process. Are you a licensed healthcare professional? Do agree or not? And we can add that to the profile so we don't have to ask them again. We start to build them up. Now, in our industry, we also have this idea of sample ordering or sample management. So healthcare professionals can order samples for certain drugs from pharmaceutical companies. That we don't want someone who's not a verified medical professional to ever be able to do. And most of our customers have master data management systems that actually maintain who is licensed and who isn't. Well, at this point, we may want to ask a series of questions that will allow us to get a positive match within our master data management system and validate the license number. If we're able to do that, we can let them in, and all they had to do was answer a few simple questions. If not, well, then they might have to call us, and we might have to add in some information manually with the data steward of that company. But what we've done here is we've created a reason to give the information, and that's the key. They want to get to sample ordering, so they need to answer these questions. We've given them a reason. They want to get to medical information. We've given them a reason to give us this additional bit of information. And that's what allows us to lower the barrier of entry and not say, hey, we want all of this information up front, because how many times have you filled out a registration form and went, why do you need this? You don't ever want your customers to ask that. You always want them to realize, this is why you need this information. So the other thing I want to point out, and I do apologize, these are slightly older screenshots, but our consent capture pages probably look pretty familiar, the actual content. And that's because they're the exact same widget, if you will. They're powered by Lightning, and we're using Lightning Out. And Lightning Out is pretty cool, and it's honestly the perfect solution for kind of these identity and consent hub problems, because you have profile management, preferences management, and consent capture. All things that are repeatable, all things that should be the same experience, all things that shouldn't have to be reinvented, and all things that should be embedded into the experience of the application you're interacting with. So we used Lightning Out to create that, and you saw that with consent capture today. And the reasons we did that is, again, build once and embed anywhere. But with anything, there's always caveats. You need to make a styling choice, and you should probably stick with it early on. Lightning allows you to enforce styling when it's embedded, or it can be unstyled, and you can let the application style it. Make that decision early on, and stick with it. You want to go with one single convention. There's good reasons to use either or. But if you go styleless, use standard conventions. You can't expect the applications you're embedding in to necessarily be able to import all of the different visual libraries, CSS files that you have built around. So you need to use all standard conventions when you're building your markup to allow those agency teams to really create unique experiences using those components so you don't have to go back and modify them. Because remember, the one negative is if you modify it, it affects everyone when you deploy something like this. The other thing is Lightning Out does not handle authentication for you. So you got to choose the right experience to actually put into Lightning Out. So all of the things I listed are short transactional experiences. And you can put prompts in, hey, we haven't heard from you in 10 minutes. Click the box, or we're going to refresh the page. The problem is if your access token dies because it expires, that's it. The page is just going to die. So you want to choose the right experiences that aren't long or that require constant user interaction. So just some food for thought there. Other things are, of course, you need to test heavily. It's new technology. It behaves weirdly sometimes. The pros vastly outweigh the cons, but test. We've had some really fun experiences embedding it on 3 different websites, and we've had instances where, hey, this JavaScript file that's fine on everywhere else happens to be conflicting on this application because it's doing something weird. So test heavily, really make sure everything works the way you would expect. Then the other thing is Locker service is great. It's secure. It's wonderful. Anyone who's implemented Lightning is very familiar with that thing. It causes a lot of headaches as you start to get over that learning curve of working with Locker service. Do it, use it, don't revert to version 39, which does not have Locker service. Do not do that. But you will spend some time wrestling with Locker service to actually get your JavaScript libraries to load remotely. Just a fair warning. Again, don't disable it, though. It's well worth it. So the last thing I want to talk about is managing omnichannel consent. So when we think about what consent language is, it's legal language followed by what are we actually allowed to do and what context are we allowed to do it in. I am allowed to email and text you about COLCAP's the context, email and text is the thing, I am allowed to do is the actual legal language. And what we did was we created the omni-channel consent cube that kind of ties all three of these pieces together. And that's essentially how we've modeled our consent. Now, to see this, we'll take Dr. Avery and we'll take the 3 pieces of consent language she's agreed to. Each of those created 1 or more omni-channel consent cubes attached to Dr. Avery. The first one gave us permission to store her data. Second one gave us permission to email, call her, and text her. The third one gave us permission to email her about this, and then to use that data for market research. The beauty of this model, though, is it actually allows for granular opt-out. I still want to hear about COLCAP, but I don't want to be called about it. Fine, let's opt you out of that. Or, one level higher, I don't want to hear about COLCAP anymore. Fine, we'll kill it. Everything goes away, but we still hear about everything else. And now, because all of our consent is in one place, we actually can do something like the right to be forgotten or total opt-out. I don't want any of my information, or I don't want to hear from you anymore, period. And we're actually able to execute that request rather than have to chase down system after system and figure out, is this Dr. Avery? Okay, let's try and remove her stuff. And this is just a glimpse inside of our org to see what that looks like. Our contact information, the consent that we've agreed to, whether it's current or not, and then one level of our permission object, which essentially controls what we're allowed to do, and that's what we synchronize to tools like Marketing Cloud and to other applications to actually say, this is what you're allowed to do and how you're allowed to interact with us. So that's an overview of the Customer Interaction Manager. That's the way we solve some of these problems. It's a lot of fun. Ian's a great guy to work with. The identity product team in general is an amazing team to work with at Salesforce. So I'm going to turn it back to Ian and let him go.
Thank you, Sam. So let's talk about some of the other things that Sam and his team have been using, our customers have been using, but may not be obvious by all this. So how many people are familiar with login flows? All right, my engineers don't count. Engineering doesn't count. Login flows are super cool. Basically, it's a workflow I can drop someone into after they authenticate. Okay, it's a visual flow, and you can do anything in it, right? So I have customers that use it to call out to external services, get other data, and update the contact record. It's a great tool to put terms of service and other consent in front of a user. So there's really creative ways that you can use this to gather more information, to validate information, to do consent, to call to third-party services. Later today, 5 o'clock in fact, because you want to pregame before you go to the concert, you need to come see Chuck and I talk at 5. We'll show some of this in a little bit more detail. But login flow, really convenient way to do progressive profiling and consent. Dynamic branding. So Sam and his team have really worked on this challenge around, I may start my journey in a lot of different places. And because I do, that's going to have impact on the brand experience I see, whether it's login or it's registration. But it also may have impact on how I register. Because I started my journey on druga.com, registration may take a different path. I may do different business logic. We, over the last couple of releases, have released a variety of features around dynamic branding. And what they do is they set a cookie called EXP-ID. You can pass it in from the third-party site. You can put it into standards identity protocols like SAML and OpenID Connect and OAuth. And when you have this value passed, writes this cookie, which you can then reference in Apex in your registration handlers and other processes. Why is that important? Because now you know how the individual has started their brand journey. And so you can use that to influence the logic of registration and may influence other decisions that you make. What it lets you do is deploy a single community, but put multiple brand experiences around the edges of that. And the cool thing is, you can then pass some of that information into communities where you're using page variants, branding sets, and their audience tool, and actually start to reconfigure the community itself based on that hint. Now, the other thing, and you're not using embedded login yet, are you? Okay, so one of the scenarios we find is that we want the seamless experience across our properties. But 2 things tend to happen. One is these properties are maybe microsites that don't have a full ability to do something like a SAML single sign-on or other single sign-on, But I want that experience, right? I need that individual to be on this digital journey with me, and I need a strong identity. So I need a way of getting them authenticated on this site that's fairly simplistic. The other thing is that we may have some applications that just don't lend themselves well to integrating with an SSO environment through standards. What embedded login is a little piece of JavaScript you drop into your website. What it does is it brokers the login experience back with your community, because this is how we express identity services, but you never leave the site. So I go to druga.com, I click login, I get a modal, I put in my username and password, or I hit social sign-on. That all happens in the context of that website. Behind the scenes, we get the sign-in process going. And in fact, what happens is we can pass back the access token to the user, which means that the site that you've integrated with can now call back to Salesforce platform and do things on behalf of the user. So it's both an interesting way to give the user an experience that says, I'm never leaving this site, I have a strong identity, I've been authenticated, and the actual application itself can actually do more things on behalf of that user. So it's a very handy way of integrating more properties into the journey of the individual. Start in different places, use it both on, say, we demonstrate it typically running on Heroku apps. You could even put it onto a Visualforce page. And I'll let your mind think about what you could do with that. But there's some really cool things you can do with embedded login to help that user journey along. There's a couple new things that came in winter, just because sometimes, let's face it, staring at our release notes is not the easiest way to figure out what's going on. So some cool things that happened in winter. Around branding. You can now pass a query parameter in URLs to us called expid, and it will set the brand parameter for you. It'll set this cookie. So why do we want to do this? Well, maybe for registration, but here's the other cool thing. If you got a community and you use the default login pages, so you don't use Visualforce and you don't use Community Builder, use the default choice, you can substitute in that expid into the URLs. Oh yeah, we added the ability to do logo and right frame content based on URL. So you got a content management system sitting out there. And if you're working with, typically in a sort of large agency scenario, the structure of that is you've got a root for your content management system, you have some brand key, and then you have all of the content, the logos, the copy, all of that. Well, you can now take that substitution parameter, expid, drop it into these URLs, and dynamically load content out of your CMS on these default login pages. And you get right frame content, which is pretty nice. We added a different kind of visual experience for login flow. Traditionally, it had just been Visualforce. We added the Lightning experience. So now we have a much more modern look and feel for those login flows, which is a big win from an experience perspective. And although this strictly didn't happen in winter 18, I'll just let you in on it, this spring, actual real spring, like in North America spring, as opposed to the way we describe spring, which is February, which is weird, we changed the external identity license. This is typically the license that people use to start getting individuals on their journeys that maybe doesn't want to use a full community license. The change we made was we added the number of custom objects. We increased the number of custom objects that license could use at a profile level. And so now we have given 10 custom objects to this license, which means if you want to model consent, if you want to do other registration things, you've got those objects available to you. And a couple things that are probably most likely, hopefully maybe, coming in spring 18, subject to forward-looking statement. Actually, these I feel pretty good about. We're going to finish out a little bit more work around dynamic branding. You'll be able to use the expid in embedded login. So essentially, you can use that drop-in JavaScript widget on a site, but also pass a brand parameter back. So you can do this dynamically. And auth providers will be able to do this. So if you use an auth provider to do social sign-on, for example, you may just embed that SSO link on a website. That's fine, but if you want to have that dynamic brand experience as the individual is transiting through Salesforce, you can now pass that back in Spring. Login flow gets something super cool. So we started with a Visualforce look and feel. We went to a Lightning look and feel. In Spring 18, most likely, you will be able to not use a visual flow, but just a Visualforce page, which means you could build a single page app, for example, in Visualforce, and that's what the user's brought to after login, and they're just going to go through that SPA and complete it. Or you don't have to present any user interface. On login, we go through the login process. You're now on a Visualforce page. Controller hits, and you can go do whatever you want to at this point. Maybe it's a third-party lookup. Maybe you want to push data somewhere else. Maybe you want to call back to the social provider that they just came in from and grab some more information. Dream up what you will. This process gives us two really cool things. Full customization of your experience now when they're in the login flow. And it can do what we refer to lovingly internally as headless login flow. Essentially, just fire the Apex controller behind the page and go do some cool stuff. The other big thing, and I'm really excited about this one, is for those of you who are doing social sign-on, or you log in with Google, log in with LinkedIn, we did a lot of work to optimize the performance here. The way we did that was we actually removed network hops in the process. So in Spring 18, for your new auth providers, if you deploy one on the Spring release, you'll get this optimization. For your existing ones, you'll actually need to check a box and redeploy the auth provider. Your callback URL will change. It's a minor tweak, but you'll have to make it. But if you do it, you will reduce the number of network hops, depending on the scenario, up to 4 to 6 network hops get pulled out of the process. And each one of those is just a little bit more time that customer is waiting to get to something. And by pulling them out, you give them a much more performant experience. I'm really excited about that one. So when you get the slides, there's a ton of resources out there for you. Everything from our Trailhead modules, especially the one for identity for customers. Highly recommend you check it out if you haven't seen it before. Some other things in terms of our Trailblazer community. The Salesforce Identity group is a great one. There's a lot of traffic on that actually this week. Some videos, some data sheets and things like that. There's some more content. Tomorrow, same time, 10:30, sorry. I'll be talking to Ducati about their journey, about how basically they took these things and actually put this into practice in a global rollout of a new experience for their customers. And you get to actually come see it, lay your hands on it in Moscone South. With that, thank you so much. Sam and I will stick around a little bit for questions. Hope this was useful. Have a great rest of Dreamforce, everybody. Take care.